Hi, and welcome to the American Short Story class. I'm just going to go over a few things, some background information about the class, and some navigation of D2L. So when you first get to the site, I think this video is going to be around here. And what you'll find is that you need to be submitting your work to both the Dropbox and to the discussion board. Almost always for the remainder of the class. The class is built on responses to readings that then you discuss with your peers by responding to them. So you should know the syllabus well, and for office hours, you want to contact me via email, and depending on your schedule, we can just work out a time to talk. We can also just field questions through email. But one of the first things you'll notice when you go to the syllabus section of content is the Ask Your Professor forum. Please do take advantage of that to ask questions that you think would benefit the entire class. It's probably a good idea to subscribe to it. And I'm pretty sure I'm already subscribed, so it's not letting me subscribe to it, but there's a way to subscribe to it so that when other people post, it'll come up as a message here. Okay, great. So obviously start with the syllabus. Let me know if you have any questions. Try to be as detailed as possible here with regard to the actual background of the class, the skills that we're going to be testing on and learning in the class, the breakdown of the assignments, and all the policies, explanations of the assignments, specifically how I grade, and overall class policies for the online course. And then we get to the schedule. So one thing that you definitely want to read before you get started writing are the guidelines for reading responses. And, like I said, you're going to be posting to the Dropbox. It's going to be an MLA style essay where you quote, analyze about 500 words, avoid plot summary, focus on analysis, focus on how the text elicits specific responses from readers, or is designed to elicit specific responses from readers. But definitely not your typical essay. You start with your first sentence being a thesis sentence. It's called an explication, where you start with a thesis and then you unfold the argument through direct analysis. And you could be asking questions as you go. Basically, you're interrogating the text and trying to support this idea of your interpretation of it. So do review your MLA style. It's just a standardization that helps to keep the essay formatted and organized for me and for your peers to read with more ease. The short story terms and definitions are also a very good thing to read in order to get your bearings in the class, and you'll find that throughout the course of the class, we will be working our way through a lot of these concepts. Plot centering on the main conflict of the story is one of the main elements that we use, right? What is the central conflict? How is the protagonist and the antagonist, how are they in conflict, and is that conflict resolved? Of course, you'll be reading Poe's single effect theory, the idea that all parts of the story hang together in a way that produces one main idea. So he says from the very first sentence, every single word, every single dot on the page of a story needs to be focused on producing the single effect. The best stories are the ones where that idea comes about very naturally, and you end up understanding what's happening without really clearly understanding how you understand that. That's what he calls the single effect. But yeah, we'll be going through point of view, some of the trickier, more interesting versions of third-person limited omniscient. The overall idea being that authors and writers are trying to convince you of something. They use language, adjectives, descriptions, scenarios to persuade you to believe certain things, and you as a reader need to be diligently, vigilantly questioning that what the authors are trying to get you to think. And so that's really what we mean by critical analysis of literature. So, the person kills somebody and the author really wants you to like this person, and you're thinking, well, this person did actually kill somebody in a pretty disgusting way. How am I supposed to like this person? That's the way that the story works. So we end up with all these characterizations, and sympathetic versus unsympathetic is something that we deal with a lot in this class. The idea that a character will be somebody you can relate to, even if the person has killed somebody or even if the person has done something terrible, there's still something about that character that you think is redeemable, versus an unsympathetic character where there's no way to ultimately justify what this character has done. And then finally, we'll be talking a lot about diction and dialect, since we're going to be looking at regionalist literature that tries to capture the sound and attitudes of specific places in the United States at specific times. Irony, of course, is something that just factors in all the time in literature, and figurative language, from metaphors to similes to everything that you learned, hopefully in 206, which will come to bear in this class. So that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of the ideas of the class. Let's get into some of the content. You'll find that we're going to start from the beginning with Edgar Allan Poe's article and Hawthorne's Melville and then Poe, the stories. One place to really get started with the content, though, is to understand the historical conditions which brought about the American short story. And I think Anne Woodliffe's American Romanticism is a really good starting place for this, right? So I'm going to start with the discussion of copyright laws. And the idea is that right around 1836, the England publishers, the Crown actually, decides that it's going to make all imports subject to the same copyright protections as other authors. So up until this time, publishers in England could just grab a book from anywhere, Germany, France, United States, and just publish it without having to pay anybody anything. So it was really bad for British authors because nobody wanted to pay them. Why should they pay them when they could just get this other stuff for free? And it was obviously really bad for all the authors everywhere else because nobody was making any money. And so I really do like this discussion of it because you start getting into the specifics, right? Where that happens in 1836 in England. And then in 1842, there's from the 1709 to the 1814 to the 1842 laws that are being put into place in the United States. You're getting more and more protections for American authors. And so what ends up happening is that by 1842, you can have a copyright on something you write for 42 years. So let's say you write something and it's really popular and you start selling hundreds and thousands of this book. And then you get to sell it overseas, right? Ideally, you're making all that money on that text. Okay, the problem, of course, is that while that's kind of happening for the most part in America, of course, America is really good at pirating things and trying to give everything for free. And so, but it is happening a lot more at this time. So authors are able to make some money doing this. And so that's really the economic backdrop of why this explosion happens. And what's really crazy too is that when you start getting into the 1890s, 1870s with Mark Twain, right? He went to Canada and he bought a house there and he set up shop in Canada so that for the publication of his book, he would technically be a resident so that he could make the money on his book that was being sold in Canada. And, while England was being fairly cool about it and actually giving the money back, most everywhere else was, I mean, it was just crazy. Like, you couldn't make any money, um, like real money, like when your book's getting sold in Germany and translation and other kinds of things. But all that really does start to change by the 1900s, so that you get somebody like Sherwood Anderson, who, is fairly successful as a copyright and editor, drops his business and starts publishing and makes a living out of it and can fairly just publish and make enough money to survive. Although that's not true for everyone. Zora Neale Hurston publishes, makes a little bit of money at the beginning, and then the royalties just aren't really there for her. She's not selling as much of her book, and she actually dies in really abject poverty. And then they start reading her book, and then she becomes the amazing power force that is Zora Neale Hurston today. But yeah, in her lifetime, she died. She died really poor. Kate Chopin also didn't make a lot of money off of her works. I mean, clearly it's a gendered thing. But yeah, definitely read up on this really interesting historical backdrop of the copyright laws and how they all came into effect and how authors were able to actually survive, feed themselves doing this. But, let's get to the nitty gritty of what this is really all about. Is that we have Americans who are just interested in creating an American identity in literature. 1776, we break away from England, and so we have all these people setting up shop in the United States. We got Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, the Transcendentals, Emerson, Thoreau, writing in the middle part of the century saying, like, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to have all these ideals of democracy and liberty? And so they react kind of to the British Romantics. And just a quick little history in the larger context, right? We've got the Age of Enlightenment, basically the late 1700s, saying that if you just put a lot of math into it, like you could chart everything, you could control everything if you just scientifically analyzed it enough. And not everybody, I'm sorry, the American authors come around after that and seeing, and the British authors just saying, like, that's ridiculous, right? Like, human nature is not something that you can figure out like that. And so Romanticism ends up responding to the Age of Enlightenment by championing individualism, the idea that the individual will do whatever the individual is going to do, no matter how much math you throw at that person. And also, of course, society is not something that you could just, draw a chart over and understand. So the darker fragmenting of society, of course, in the United States, the United States was one of the last countries to abolish slavery, and it, of course, leads to the Civil War. So at the backdrop of all of these authors starting to define American identity, we have major race issues and a changing of an economic paradigm from slavery to the post-slavery economic industrialization. So, you're getting all of that, and you're also getting a lot of religious, people came from England for religious freedom. And so you have all these different groups like setting up shop all over the place and, fighting for their religious autonomy. So it's just, that's really the backdrop of the 19th century American literature. When we get to realism after this, you're going to have a literature of social justice. That's, sort of really starting now to actually figure out, like, okay, so we have all these different groups of people, and these are their needs. How are we going to meet their needs? And then when we get to modernism, it's just a whole different animal of, kind of retaliating against that and saying literature should be, for its own sake, it should be something beautiful that should not have social justice at its core, but should move you as an individual, as an intellectual. Okay, so that's my 15 minutes of fame here, I think. I'm going to really just try to squeeze in a couple of things. Just note that you will be posting to both the Dropbox and to the discussion board. And the last little thing I want to say concerns the best way to post to the Dropbox. which is that you should go to the actual Dropbox assignment. Here you can have and really